Welcome back to Second Chance Histories, where we explore the extraordinary moments that challenge our understanding of consciousness, forgiveness, and the power of the human spirit to find redemption even in the darkest circumstances. Today's story takes us into the mind of a man suspended between life and death, where consciousness becomes a courtroom and shadows hold the power to heal or condemn. When 42-year-old James Crawford lay in a medically induced coma following a devastating car accident, he experienced something that would transform not only his understanding of his own life, but his relationship with every person he had ever hurt. This is the story of Between Life and Shadow, where a man's journey through his unconscious mind revealed that sometimes the hardest person to forgive is yourself. And sometimes that forgiveness can only come when you finally understand the true weight of your actions and the possibility of genuine redemption. James Michael Crawford had built what appeared to be a successful life by the age of 42. He owned a thriving construction company in Denver, Colorado, drove expensive cars, and lived in a house that impressed his neighbors. But beneath the surface of material success lay a pattern of behavior that had left a trail of hurt feelings, broken relationships, and damaged lives. James was what psychologists might call a functional narcissist, someone who could maintain professional success and social relationships while consistently prioritizing his own needs over everyone else's well-being. He was charming when it served his purposes, ruthless when it advanced his goals, and seemingly incapable of genuine empathy for the people his choices affected. His ex-wife, Linda, had left him 3 years earlier, taking their 2 teenage children, Emma, 16, and Michael, 14, with her. The divorce had been bitter, with James fighting every custody arrangement and support payment, not because he wanted more time with his children, but because he refused to be told what to do or forced to give up what he considered his money. His business practices were aggressive to the point of being predatory. He regularly underpaid subcontractors, found legal loopholes to avoid honoring warranty commitments, and had built his reputation on taking advantage of desperate homeowners who couldn't afford to fight his questionable billing practices. James had alienated most of his family through a combination of borrowed money that was never repaid, missed family events because work came first, and a general attitude that other people's problems were not his concern. His younger brother David hadn't spoken to him in 2 years after James had refused to help with their mother's medical bills, claiming he couldn't afford it, while posting pictures of his latest vacation on social media. Even his friendships were transactional. James maintained relationships only with people who could benefit his business or social status. He was a friend who disappeared when others needed support, but expected loyalty when he needed favors. The pattern had been consistent for decades. James Crawford took what he wanted from relationships and situations, gave as little as possible in return, and convinced himself that this was simply smart business and looking out for number one. But on a rainy Thursday evening in November 2019, James Crawford's carefully constructed world would come crashing down in ways he never could have imagined. James had been driving home from a business meeting, talking on his phone despite the law against it, when his BMW hydroplaned on a wet curve and collided head-on with a delivery truck. The impact was devastating. The truck driver walked away with minor injuries, but James was airlifted to Denver General Hospital with severe head trauma, multiple fractures, and internal bleeding. For 3 days, doctors fought to save his life. His brain had swollen significantly from the impact, and they made the decision to induce a medical coma to give his body time to heal. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the attending urologist, was cautiously optimistic about his physical recovery, but warned his family that the extent of any brain damage wouldn't be known until he regained consciousness. Linda brought Emma and Michael to the hospital despite their complicated relationship with their father. Whatever James's failings as a husband and father, he was still the children's dad, and she wanted them to have the chance to say goodbye if necessary. "I know your father wasn't always there for us," Linda told Emma and Michael as they stood beside his hospital bed, "but he's still a person who deserves our compassion during his fight for life." Emma, mature beyond her 16 years, looked at her unconscious father with a mixture of love and frustration that perfectly captured their relationship. I just wish he could understand how much he hurt people. Maybe then things could be different. What none of them knew was that James was about to gain exactly that understanding in the most profound and terrifying way possible. On his 4th day in the coma, James became aware of his surroundings in a way that was completely different from normal consciousness. He found himself standing in what appeared to be his hospital room, able to see his own body lying motionless in bed, but the room was filled with shadows, dark, human-shaped figures that seemed to be watching him with intense focus. At first, James thought he was experiencing a nightmare or hallucination. The shadows had no distinct features, but somehow he could sense emotions radiating from them: anger, sadness, disappointment, and pain. As he tried to understand what he was seeing, one of the shadows stepped forward and suddenly took on a clear, recognizable form. It was Linda, but not as she appeared in real life. This version of Linda showed the accumulated weight of years of emotional neglect, financial manipulation, and broken promises. Her face bore the lines of stress from raising 2 children essentially alone, while married to a man who treated his family like an inconvenience. "James," the shadow Linda said, her voice carrying years of suppressed hurt. "Do you see me now? Do you finally see what your selfishness did to our family?" James tried to speak, to defend himself, to explain that he had been providing for the family, working hard to give them a good life, but no sound came from his mouth. He was forced to listen as Linda's shadow began to show him moments from their marriage that he had forgotten or chosen to ignore. He watched himself missing Emma's school plays because he was networking at business dinners. He saw himself dismissing Linda's concerns about their son's struggles in school because he was focused on an important contract bid. He witnessed his own indifference to Linda's attempts to discuss their relationship problems, always brushing off her concerns with promises that he was too busy right now to deal with domestic issues. "You weren't just absent, James," Shadow Linda continued. "You were actively harmful. Every time I tried to connect with you, you made me feel like I was bothering you with trivialities. Every time the children needed their father, you taught them that work was more important than they were." The shadow showed him Linda crying alone in their bedroom after he had missed their wedding anniversary dinner for the 3rd year in a row. She had stopped trying to plan special occasions because his rejection of her efforts hurt more than his indifference. As Shadow Linda faded back into a group of waiting figures, James felt something he had rarely experienced: genuine shame about his behavior and its impact on someone else. Over what felt like hours, but could have been days, in his altered state of consciousness, more shadows stepped forward to confront James with the reality of his actions and their consequences. The shadow of his brother David appeared next, showing James the night their mother had been hospitalized with a heart attack. David had called James, desperate for help with the mounting medical bills, only to be told that James had his own family to think about and couldn't afford to help. "She died worried about the debt she was leaving us," Shadow David said with bitter sadness. "She spent her last months feeling like a burden instead of feeling supported by her sons. You had 3 times my income, James, but you let our mother die in financial stress because helping her wasn't convenient for you." James watched himself at his mother's funeral, making a show of grief while privately calculating how much time he could afford to take off work. He saw David's face as James had brushed off his attempts to discuss settling their mother's affairs, claiming he was too busy to deal with paperwork and estate issues. The shadow of his son Michael appeared, showing James countless moments when the boy had tried to connect with his father. There was 8-year-old Michael proudly showing James a drawing he'd made, only to be dismissed because James was checking email. There was 12-year-old Michael asking for help with a science project, being told that James didn't have time for kid stuff. There was 14-year-old Michael trying to talk to his father about bullying at school, only to be advised to toughen up and stop being so sensitive. "I stopped trying to talk to you," Shadow Michael said with the heartbreaking wisdom of a child who had learned not to expect emotional support from a parent. "I learned that anything I cared about wasn't important enough for your attention. Do you know what that does to a kid, Dad? Do you know what it feels like to believe your own father thinks you're not worth his time?" Emma's shadow was perhaps the most painful, showing James how his treatment of Linda had taught his daughter what to expect from men. He watched teenage Emma unconsciously accepting disrespectful behavior from boyfriends because she had learned from watching her parents that men's priorities always came before women's needs. "You didn't just hurt Mom," Shadow Emma said. "You taught me that love means accepting being ignored and dismissed." It took years of counseling for me to understand that I deserved better than what I saw in our house. The shadows weren't limited to family members. James found himself confronting the human cost of his business practices, something he had always rationalized away as just business or market competition. The shadow of Maria Gonzalez appeared, a single mother who had hired James's company to repair her roof after hail damage. James had deliberately inflated the scope of work needed, charging her nearly twice what the job was worth because he knew she was desperate and didn't understand construction. "I took out a second mortgage to pay your bill," Shadow Maria said, her form radiating the stress of financial desperation. "I lost my house 6 months later when I couldn't keep up with the payments. My children and I lived in a shelter for 4 months because of your greed." James watched himself reviewing Maria's contract, knowing full well that he was overcharging but justifying it by telling himself that she agreed to the price, and business is business. The shadow of Tom Bradley, a subcontractor James had systematically underpaid, showed the devastating impact of James's refusal to honor payment agreements. Tom's small electrical business had gone bankrupt when James withheld payment on 3 major jobs, claiming the work didn't meet specifications even though he had accepted and used the work. "I had to lay off 8 employees because you wouldn't pay what you owed," Shadow Tom said. "Good people lost their jobs, and some of them lost their houses. My wife left me because the stress of fighting you for money we had earned destroyed our marriage." Each shadow revealed not just James's actions, but their cascading effects on families, communities, and individual lives. He began to understand that his smart business practices had created networks of real human suffering that extended far beyond the immediate victims of his selfishness. As more shadows appeared, former employees he had fired to avoid paying benefits, elderly clients he had taken advantage of, friends whose trust he had betrayed for personal gain, James felt overwhelmed by the accumulated weight of his life's impact on others. He tried to justify his actions, to argue that he was simply being practical and looking out for his own interests in a competitive world. But in this shadow realm, his usual rationalizations held no power. He was forced to experience not just what he had done, but the full emotional reality of how his choices had affected other people. The most devastating moment came when the shadow of his younger self appeared. The idealistic 22-year-old James, who had started his business with dreams of building something meaningful and helping families create beautiful homes. "When did you stop caring about anyone but yourself?" Shadow young James asked. "When did making money become more important than being a good person? When did you decide that other people's pain didn't matter as long as you got what you wanted?" James watched his younger self gradually transform over the years, making small compromises that seemed reasonable at the time but had accumulated into a pattern of selfishness and callousness that had defined his adult life. For the first time in decades, James Crawford felt genuine remorse. Not just regret for getting caught or facing consequences, but actual sorrow for the pain he had caused other people. The weight of recognition was almost unbearable. As James reached what felt like the breaking point of his ability to face more evidence of his harmful impact on the world, one final shadow stepped forward. But this shadow was different from all the others. It radiated not anger or pain, but something that felt like compassion and understanding. To James's amazement, the shadow took the form of himself, not his younger idealistic self, but himself as he was now, lying unconscious in the hospital bed. But this version of himself was different, calmer, more thoughtful, emanating a sense of wisdom and peace that James had never experienced. "James," the shadow self said gently, "do you understand now why you're here? Do you see what needs to happen for you to heal?" James found his voice for the first time since entering the shadow realm. "I've been a terrible person," he said, the words feeling strange and difficult to speak. "I've hurt so many people. I don't know how to fix what I've broken." Shadow James smiled with infinite patience. "Understanding the harm you've caused is the first step, but it's not the last step. The question isn't whether you deserve forgiveness. It's whether you're willing to do the hard work of earning it." "What do you mean?" James asked. "Forgiveness isn't something that happens to you," Shadow James explained. "It's something you participate in creating. Every person you've hurt deserves to have their pain acknowledged. Every relationship you've damaged deserves your genuine effort to repair it. Every pattern of harmful behavior deserves your commitment to change." Shadow James gestured to all the other shadows still gathered around them. "These people, your family, your victims, everyone you've impacted, they're not here to punish you. They're here to show you what real accountability looks like. They're offering you the chance to become someone worthy of the life you've been given." What happened next would determine not just James's recovery from the coma, but the entire trajectory of his remaining years. "You have a choice to make," Shadow James continued. "You can wake up and go back to your old patterns, using this experience as just another story about your survival and resilience. Or you can wake up as someone fundamentally different, someone committed to repairing the damage you've done and living in a way that honors the pain you've caused." James looked around at all the shadows surrounding him. Every person he had hurt, every life he had negatively impacted, every relationship he had damaged through his selfishness and callousness. "If I choose to change," James asked, "will they forgive me?" Shadow James shook his head. "That's not how forgiveness works. You don't get to control whether other people forgive you. You only get to control whether you become someone worth forgiving. Some of these people may never be able to forgive you, and that's their right. Your job isn't to earn their forgiveness. It's to earn your own right to keep living by making sure your remaining years create more healing than harm." The insight hit James like a physical blow. He had spent his entire adult life trying to control outcomes, manipulate situations to his advantage, and avoid consequences for his actions. The idea that he could only control his own behavior, not other people's responses to that behavior, was both terrifying and liberating. "What if I try to change and fail?" James asked. "What if I can't overcome the patterns I've built over decades?" "Then you fail honorably," Shadow James replied. "And you get up and try again. The people you've hurt deserve your best effort, even if that effort isn't perfect, especially if that effort isn't perfect." As James considered the choice before him, he began to understand that this moment in the shadow realm was the most important decision point of his life. He could return to consciousness unchanged and continue the patterns that had brought him here, or he could use his revelation as a foundation for becoming a fundamentally different person. "I choose to change," James said finally. "I don't know how to do it, and I'm scared that I'll fail, but I choose to try." As soon as he spoke those words, the shadows around him began to change. Instead of radiating pain and anger, they began to emanate something that felt like hope and possibility. They weren't offering him easy forgiveness, but they were offering him the chance to earn a different kind of relationship with them. Shadow Linda stepped forward one last time. "James, if you're serious about changing, you need to understand that it means giving up control. It means accepting that other people's needs are as important as yours. It means choosing their well-being over your convenience, their feelings over your pride." Shadow Michael and Shadow Emma joined her. "It means being the father we needed instead of the father you thought was good enough," Shadow Emma said. It means learning to love us more than you love being right. Shadow David appeared beside them. It means being the brother who shows up when family needs help, not just when you need something. One by one, the shadows of everyone James had hurt offered him specific guidance about what real change would require. They weren't demanding perfection, but they were demanding genuine effort, sustained commitment, and authentic accountability. Most importantly, Shadow James said as the experience began to fade, it means accepting that you can't undo the harm you've caused. You can only prevent future harm and work to create healing wherever possible. That's what redemption actually looks like. James Crawford opened his eyes on a Tuesday morning after 8 days in a medically induced coma. Dr. Mitchell was amazed by his rapid neurological recovery. His brain function appeared to be completely normal, with no signs of the damage they had feared from his traumatic injuries. But James himself knew immediately that something fundamental had changed. The experience in the shadow realm hadn't been a dream or hallucination. It had been the most real experience of his life. He remembered every conversation, every revelation, every moment of understanding with perfect clarity. His first words upon waking were directed to Linda, who was sitting beside his bed. "I'm sorry. I know that's not enough. And I know I don't have any right to ask for your forgiveness. But I want you to know that I finally understand what I did to you, to our children, to our family. And I want to spend whatever time I have left trying to make things right." Linda was shocked by the sincerity in his voice. In 20 years of marriage and 3 years of divorce proceedings, she had never heard James speak with genuine remorse or acknowledge the specific ways his behavior had hurt other people. "James," she said carefully, "I'm glad you're alive, and I hope your recovery goes well. But words are easy. I've heard you make promises before." "I know," James replied, "and I know that my actions are the only thing that will matter. I'm not asking you to believe me or forgive me. I'm just asking you to let me try to be different." James's recovery from his physical injuries was remarkably swift, but his recovery from decades of selfish behavior patterns would prove to be a much longer and more challenging process. Upon leaving the hospital, James made several immediate changes that shocked everyone who knew him. He liquidated his expensive car collection and used the money to establish a fund for helping families who had been financially harmed by his business practices. He sold his large house and moved to a modest apartment, donating the difference to local charities that supported single parents and families in crisis. More importantly, he began the difficult work of direct accountability to the people he had hurt. James reached out to Maria Gonzalez, the single mother whose overcharging had contributed to her losing her home. He didn't just refund her money. He helped her secure a new mortgage and personally supervised the proper completion of repairs to her current home at no charge. He contacted Tom Bradley, the contractor whose business had been destroyed by James's refusal to pay for completed work. James not only paid what he had originally owed with interest, but helped Tom restart his electrical business by serving as a referral source and providing startup capital. The work with his family was even more challenging. James began seeing a therapist to understand the psychological patterns that had driven his selfish behavior. He started attending family counseling sessions with Linda and the children, not to try to save his marriage, but to learn how to be a better co-parent and to give his family a safe space to express their feelings about his past behavior. "Dad," Michael said during one particularly difficult session, "it's going to take a long time for me to trust that this change is real. You've let me down too many times." "I understand," James replied, "and I want you to know that even if you never feel able to trust me again, I'm going to keep trying to be the father you deserve to have. Not because I expect forgiveness, but because it's the right thing to do." As months passed, the people in James's life began to notice that his changes weren't superficial or temporary. He had fundamentally altered how he approached relationships, business, and daily life. In his business, James completely restructured his practices. He began offering fair pricing with transparent contracts, honoring warranties without dispute, and treating subcontractors as partners rather than exploitable resources. His profit margins decreased significantly, but his reputation for integrity began to attract clients who valued honesty over aggressive pricing. His relationship with his children slowly began to heal. Emma, initially skeptical of her father's transformation, gradually began to trust that his interest in her life was genuine rather than performative. The biggest difference, Emma told her mother after 6 months of regular contact with James, is that he listens now. Before, when I talked to Dad, I always felt like he was waiting for me to finish, so he could get back to whatever he considered important. Now it feels like I'm what's important when I'm talking to him. James's relationship with David required even more patience. David had been deeply hurt by James's refusal to help with their mother's medical expenses, and it took over a year of consistent, respectful outreach before David was willing to have a conversation. "I need you to understand," David told James during their first phone call in 3 years, "that Mom died feeling abandoned by one of her sons. That's a wound that doesn't heal just because you decided to be different now." "I know," James replied, "and I carry the responsibility for that every day. I can't change what I did to Mom, but I can make sure I never again choose money over family. I can make sure that if anyone in our family needs help in the future, I'll be someone they can count on." As James continued his commitment to living differently, the positive effects began to extend beyond his immediate circle of relationships. His business became known as one of the most ethical construction companies in Denver, attracting both clients and employees who valued integrity over profit maximization. James began mentoring other business owners about sustainable, ethical practices. He spoke at industry conferences about the personal and professional costs of prioritizing short-term profits over long-term relationships and reputation. "I spent 2 decades building financial success on the foundation of other people's pain," James told one conference audience. "It took a near-death experience for me to understand that success built on harm to others isn't actually success, it's delayed failure. Real success means creating value for everyone you work with, not just extracting value from them." James also became involved in community organizations focused on helping people recover from financial predation. He worked with legal aid societies to identify and assist victims of unethical business practices, using his knowledge of industry tactics to help vulnerable consumers protect themselves. His transformation inspired others who had been living similar patterns of selfishness and emotional unavailability. James received letters from people who had heard about his story and were inspired to examine their own relationships and behavior patterns. 3 years after his coma experience, James had rebuilt his relationships with his children into something genuine and supportive, though different from what they might have been if he had been a better father from the beginning. Emma was in college, studying social work, and credited her father's transformation with inspiring her to help others navigate difficult life changes. Michael, now 17, had developed a close relationship with his father built on honesty and mutual respect rather than obligation and disappointment. "I'm proud of my dad now," Michael said during a family gathering. Not because he's perfect, but because he was willing to face how much harm he had caused and do the really hard work of changing. That takes more courage than I think most people have. James's relationship with Linda remained cordial but appropriately boundaried. She had found peace with their divorce and had begun dating someone who treated her with consistent kindness and respect. "I appreciate the man James had become," Linda reflected, "and I'm grateful that our children have a father they can respect and trust. But I also learned that I deserve to be treated well from the beginning of a relationship, not just after someone realizes they've been treating me poorly." James understood and accepted Linda's position. Part of his growth had been learning that genuine accountability meant accepting the consequences of his actions, including the reality that some relationships couldn't be fully repaired. Dr. Mitchell, James's neurologist, had been intrigued by his patient's dramatic personality transformation following the coma. She had seen other cases where near-death experiences led to significant changes in patients' values and behavior. But James's transformation was unusually comprehensive and sustained. Dr. Mitchell contacted Dr. Raymond Chun, a researcher at the University of Colorado who studied consciousness and personality change following traumatic brain injuries and coma experiences. James's case represents one of the most dramatic and well-documented examples of positive personality transformation following a coma that I've encountered. Dr. Chin concluded after interviewing James extensively. His experience in the altered state of consciousness seems to have provided him with a perspective on his own behavior and its effects that he had never achieved during normal consciousness. Dr. Chin documented James's case as part of a larger study on how extreme medical events can sometimes catalyze profound psychological and spiritual growth. The research suggested that the combination of facing mortality and experiencing altered states of consciousness could create optimal conditions for individuals to honestly assess their lives and make fundamental changes. James's transformation demonstrates that personality patterns that seem fixed and unchangeable can actually be altered when individuals gain sufficient motivation and insight, Dr. Chin published in his research. The key factors appear to be genuine recognition of the harm one has caused, authentic remorse for that harm, and sustained commitment to different behavior patterns. 5 years after his accident, James Crawford had become someone his former self would barely recognize. His construction business was smaller in terms of revenue, but more successful in terms of employee satisfaction, client relationships, and community reputation. He had continued his practice of regular therapy, understanding that the patterns he had built over decades required ongoing vigilance and commitment to maintain his changes. James had also become involved in speaking to groups about accountability, redemption, and the possibility of genuine personal transformation. He was particularly effective speaking to men who, like his former self, had prioritized career success over relationships and family well-being. The hardest thing about changing, James told one men's group, isn't learning new behaviors. It's accepting that you were responsible for real harm to real people, and that your good intentions or your rationalizations don't erase that harm. But once you accept that responsibility, you discover that you have the power to make sure your remaining years create healing instead of hurt. James maintained a practice he had started during his recovery. Every morning, he spent time remembering the people he had hurt and recommitting to living in a way that honored their pain and contributed to healing rather than harm. Today, James Crawford is 47 years old and considers the accident that nearly killed him to be the most important event of his life. Not because it gave him a supernatural experience, but because it gave him the motivation and insight necessary to become someone worthy of the relationships he had damaged and the life he had been given. His children, now young adults, have a father who is genuinely present for their important moments, who listens to their concerns with real attention, and who has taught them through his transformation that it's possible to acknowledge mistakes, take accountability for harm caused, and commit to living differently. His business practices have influenced other contractors in Denver to adopt more ethical approaches to customer relationships and employee treatment. James estimates that his transformation has indirectly benefited hundreds of families who have received fairer treatment from businesses that adopted his ethical practices. The shadows I saw during my coma weren't supernatural, James reflects. They were my own conscience finally showing me the truth about my impact on other people's lives. The real miracle wasn't the experience itself. It was discovering that I could choose to become someone different, and that other people were willing to give me the chance to prove that change was genuine. The story of James Crawford's transformation reminds us that no one is beyond the possibility of genuine change, but that real transformation requires complete honesty about the harm we've caused, sustained commitment to different behavior, and acceptance that we cannot control whether others choose to forgive us. Between life and shadow, James discovered that the most important person he needed to learn to forgive was himself. not by excusing his past behavior, but by committing to ensure that his future actions would create healing rather than harm. His journey from selfishness to service, from causing pain to creating healing, proves that even the darkest patterns of behavior can be transformed when we find the courage to face the full truth about ourselves and the sustained commitment to become someone better. In a world that often seems divided between those who cause harm and those who suffer from it, James Crawford's story offers hope that people can move from one category to the other, that accountability, effort, and genuine change can transform even the most damaged relationships and create the possibility of redemption. The shadows between life and death showed James Crawford who he had been. His waking life gave him the opportunity to choose who he would become. And in that choice, he discovered that the greatest miracle isn't avoiding the consequences of our actions. It's finding the courage to face those consequences and use them as a foundation for becoming someone worthy of the gift of continued life.